Before you send another message, before you make one more attempt to explain yourself, pause for a moment. There is something you need to understand first. Most people, especially when they're afraid of losing someone, do the exact opposite of what actually helps. They talk more. They apologize more. They become more available. They believe that if they just prove their loyalty one more time, the other person will finally recognize their value. But human psychology rarely works that way. There is an uncomfortable truth that many people spend years resisting because it challenges the way they think love and connection should work. The more something is constantly available, the easier it becomes to overlook. It doesn't matter how kind you are, how dependable you've been, or how many sacrifices you've made. If your attention is always guaranteed, people naturally begin to expect it instead of appreciating it. This isn't always because someone is selfish or intentionally taking advantage of you. It's a tendency built into human nature. Our minds are designed to notice change, uncertainty, and contrast. What remains constant often fades quietly into the background. Once you truly recognize this pattern, the way you approach relationships begins to change. Throughout history, whether in leadership, business, friendships, or romance, one principle appears again and again. The person who is constantly present slowly loses influence. The person who understands the value of stepping back creates curiosity without saying a word. Think about the people who occupied your thoughts the most. Were they always immediately available? Did they answer every message the second it arrived, or was there something about them that left you wondering, thinking, trying to understand them? This isn't about manipulation or playing games. It's about understanding how attention actually works. When the mind believes something will always be there, it stops giving that thing conscious attention. It labels it as permanent, predictable, guaranteed. And once something feels guaranteed, appreciation often begins to disappear. It's similar to the things we rely on every single day. Very few people wake up each morning amazed that the lights turn on with a switch or that clean water comes from the faucet. Those comforts become invisible because they've become expected. The same thing can happen in relationships. Someone can be deeply caring, endlessly patient, and completely loyal, yet still become invisible in the eyes of the person they're trying hardest to keep close. Not because they lacked value, because they never stopped giving. So what can you do? The answer isn't revenge. It isn't making someone jealous, and it certainly isn't disappearing in hopes of forcing a reaction. The real shift begins when you stop investing every ounce of your emotional energy into someone who has stopped investing back. Instead of chasing their attention, you redirect that attention toward your own life. At first, that change feels uncomfortable. The silence can feel almost unbearable. Every instinct inside you will want to reach out, explain yourself, or restore the old pattern. Resist that urge, because while you're learning to sit with that silence, something important is happening. When someone who has always been available suddenly becomes focused on their own life, the absence creates a question that wasn't there before. Where did they go? Why aren't they reaching out? What changed? The human brain dislikes unanswered questions. It naturally searches for closure whenever a familiar pattern is interrupted. That interruption often restores awareness far more effectively than endless explanations ever could. No amount of over-explaining can create the same effect as genuine emotional distance rooted in self-respect. But this is where most people misunderstand the lesson. The greatest benefit isn't whether the other person notices. The greatest benefit is what begins happening inside you. The moment you stop monitoring every delayed reply, every mixed signal, and every small change in someone's behavior, you slowly reclaim parts of yourself that you've been neglecting. You begin remembering who you were before your self-worth depended on another person's attention. That is where the real transformation starts. Most people believe the difficult part is creating distance. It isn't. The real challenge begins after you've created it. When the constant messages stop, when you're no longer checking your phone every few minutes, and when the relationship is no longer consuming every waking thought, you're left with something many people spend years avoiding, your own company. For some, that silence feels peaceful. For others, it feels terrifying, not because they're lonely, but because the chase had become a distraction from questions they never wanted to ask themselves. Why did another person's approval become so important? Why did one conversation have the power to determine whether the day felt successful or disappointing? Why was losing someone interpreted as losing yourself? These questions reveal something much deeper than a relationship problem. They expose a pattern. Many of the habits we carry into adulthood were quietly formed long before we understood what healthy connection looked like. If affection felt unpredictable growing up, uncertainty may now feel strangely familiar. If attention had to be earned, you may unconsciously believe that love always requires proving yourself. Without realizing it, you begin repeating the same emotional story with different people, different names, different faces, the same ending. You find yourself working harder than everyone else, giving more than you receive, accepting behavior today that you promised yourself yesterday you would never tolerate. Eventually, you start calling this commitment. You call it patience. You call it unconditional love. But sometimes it isn't love at all. Sometimes it's simply an old emotional pattern wearing a new face. Recognizing that truth isn't meant to create guilt. It's meant to create freedom, because once you can identify the pattern, you no longer have to live inside it. Real confidence doesn't appear the moment someone apologizes or comes back into your life. It develops when your emotional stability no longer depends on whether they return. That shift changes everything. You stop interpreting every delayed response as rejection. You stop inventing explanations for inconsistent behavior. You stop trying to earn a place where you should already feel welcome. Instead, you begin paying attention to something far more important: how people consistently treat you. Consistency always reveals more than promises. Anyone can say the right words during emotional moments. Character is revealed through repeated actions. When your standards become clearer, your decisions become easier. You no longer negotiate with obvious disrespect. You no longer confuse mixed signals with mystery. You no longer mistake emotional intensity for genuine connection. And something remarkable begins to happen. The desperation that once shaped your decisions starts disappearing. You become calmer, more patient, less reactive. Ironically, this is often when people begin noticing the change, not because you became distant, because your energy stopped asking for permission to exist. Whether someone reaches out again becomes less important than it once was. Your attention is no longer centered on their next move. It's centered on building a life that feels meaningful regardless of who stays or leaves. That is where authentic self-respect begins, not in winning someone back, not in proving your worth, but in reaching the point where your value is no longer waiting for someone else's recognition. Many people believe they keep ending up with the wrong person because they're simply unlucky. But what if it isn't luck at all? What if the pattern keeps repeating because something inside you keeps choosing what feels familiar instead of what is actually healthy? That idea is uncomfortable because it shifts the focus away from everyone else and back onto ourselves. For years, you may think you're searching for a better relationship when in reality you're unconsciously recreating an old emotional experience. The faces are different. The names are different. The circumstances change. Yet somehow the emotional ending feels almost identical every single time. That isn't coincidence. It's information. Your mind is trying to show you something you haven't fully understood yet. Psychologists have long observed that people are naturally drawn toward what feels familiar, even when that familiarity causes pain. The nervous system prefers the predictable. It would rather experience a struggle it already understands than step into a kind of peace it has never learned to trust. That explains why stability can sometimes feel strangely uncomfortable. When someone is emotionally consistent, communicates clearly, and treats you with respect, part of you should feel safe. But if your early experiences taught you that love had to be earned, consistency may feel unfamiliar instead. You begin questioning their intentions. You wonder if they're too good to be true. You wait for the disappointment that never arrives. Slowly, you create distance from the very relationship you've always claimed to want. Then someone unpredictable appears. Their attention comes and goes. Their affection is inconsistent. You never quite know where you stand. Oddly enough, that uncertainty feels exciting. You mistake emotional tension for emotional depth. You mistake unpredictability for passion. But what you're responding to isn't love. You're responding to recognition. Your mind recognizes an old emotional blueprint and labels it as home. That's why changing your relationships begins with changing your beliefs about yourself. Ask yourself an honest question, not the answer you'd give your friends, not the answer you'd post online, the real answer. Deep down, what do you believe you're worthy of receiving? Because your standards are revealed far more by your choices than by your words. Self-worth isn't measured by what you say you deserve. It's measured by what you're willing to tolerate. Every time you ignore obvious disrespect, every time you excuse repeated disappointment, every time you silence your own needs just to keep someone from leaving, you quietly teach yourself that your boundaries don't matter. Eventually, other people begin believing the same thing. This is why boundaries are so often misunderstood. A boundary isn't about controlling another person's behavior. It isn't an attempt to change them. A healthy boundary is a commitment you make to yourself. It defines what you will and will not continue participating in. And every meaningful boundary carries a consequence. Without consequences, boundaries become nothing more than wishes. People naturally adjust their behavior according to what they believe is acceptable. If disrespect never costs them anything, they eventually assume it isn't disrespect at all. Think back to the beginning of any relationship that later became unhealthy. The shift rarely happened overnight. It usually started with something small, a broken promise, a careless comment, an ignored need, a repeated disappointment that you convinced yourself wasn't important enough to mention. One small compromise became another, then another. Before long, the relationship had quietly established a new normal, not because anyone announced it, because both people adapted to it. Real change begins the moment you decide that your peace is no longer negotiable. That single decision transforms every relationship you'll ever have, starting with the one you have with yourself. People rarely stop appreciating you in a single moment. It almost never happens all at once. It happens through dozens of small moments that seem too insignificant to matter at the time. A promise gets broken, and you tell yourself it isn't worth mentioning. A conversation leaves you feeling dismissed, but you convince yourself you're overthinking it. You keep giving more while receiving less, yet you continue because you don't want to appear difficult. Little by little, a new standard is established, not because anyone openly agreed to it, because every unchallenged behavior quietly teaches another person what you are willing to accept. Human beings naturally adjust to the limits that exist around them. When there are no limits, people often take more than they realize, not always out of cruelty, often out of habit. Real transformation begins when you decide that your standards are no longer negotiable, not for 3 days, not until someone texts you back forever. That decision sounds simple, but living by it requires courage. It means refusing to make choices driven by fear, not the fear of abandonment, not the fear of disappointing people, not even the fear of ending up alone. Instead, every decision begins with a different question. Is this aligned with the person I'm trying to become? When your choices are guided by values instead of anxiety, everything about the way you communicate begins to change. You stop expecting people to guess your needs. You express them calmly and directly. You stop rehearsing difficult conversations 100 times inside your head before finally speaking. You replace assumptions with honesty. And something fascinating happens. The words themselves may not change very much, but the person speaking them has changed. People don't only respond to language, they respond to conviction. They sense whether your confidence comes self-respect or from a desperate hope that they'll approve of you. That inner difference changes every interaction. There is another consequence of feeling undervalued that few people recognize until much later. It's the gradual loss of identity. It doesn't happen dramatically, it happens quietly. You begin organizing your schedule around someone else's priorities. Your emotional state rises and falls according to their attention. You stop asking yourself what you want because you become too busy anticipating what they want without realizing it. Your world starts revolving around someone who may not even notice the sacrifice you're making. The way back isn't found by making them appreciate you. It's found by remembering yourself. Return to the interests you abandoned. Pick up the goals you placed on hold. Reconnect with the friendships that slowly faded into the background. Spend enough quiet time alone that your own voice becomes familiar again. This isn't distraction, it's reconstruction. You're rebuilding the version of yourself that existed before you measured your worth through another person's approval. And that version of you carries a quiet strength that cannot be imitated. People are naturally drawn to those who are complete within themselves, not because they're perfect, because they're authentic. Now, you might be wondering what actually happens after all of this. Will they come back? Sometimes they will. The distance gives them space to recognize what they overlooked. They begin reflecting on the role they played. They reach out with a different attitude. But if you've truly grown, you'll notice something important. You'll no longer be impressed simply because someone returned. You'll pay attention to why they returned. Did they genuinely change? Or did they simply miss the comfort of having unrestricted access to you? Those are not the same thing. One creates a healthier future. The other recreates the past. And yes, there are times when they never come back. As painful as that can be, it often provides the clarity you've needed all along. No more wondering, no more false hope, no more waiting for someone to become who they repeatedly showed you they weren't ready to be. That clarity creates space. Space for healthier relationships, space for deeper peace. Most importantly, space to become the person you were meant to be. After years of studying human behavior, one lesson appears again and again. The people who command the deepest respect are rarely the ones trying hardest to earn it. They know who they are. They invest in their own growth. They maintain standards without becoming cold. They remain kind without abandoning themselves. Their confidence isn't loud, it's steady. And that's exactly what you're building. Not a strategy to make someone miss you. Not a formula for becoming more desirable. You're building a life that no longer depends on another person's approval to feel meaningful. Once you reach that point, the question changes completely. Instead of asking, why doesn't this person value me? You begin asking, does this relationship deserve a place in the life I've built? That single shift changes everything. Because the greatest form of validation isn't receiving someone's attention, it's becoming the kind of person who no longer needs it to recognize their own worth.